So I think I'm not going to fall asleep. I think I should be okay. I should also, following up on Doug's observation about his not using PowerPoint was a sign of innovation. I also have an innovation in relation to PowerPoint, but it's the opposite, since I am a technological dinosaur and resisted going to PowerPoints as long as I could until I finally realized that my 23-year-old students, if they didn't see it on a screen, it didn't happen. So I went completely in the opposite direction to all sorts of PowerPoints and streaming things and so forth. We'll see how it works. But like I say, this is not the real me. This has been a major change process for me to try to do this. At any rate, so I am going to be talking about organizational change in government in general, whether it be for productivity improvements, service delivery improvements, whatever. I'm going to be talking about in general and talk a little bit at the end about the specific context of austerity or pressure or challenge. But basically what I'm going to be talking about is, initiating a change process, consolidating a change process, and then again specifically on change in the context of budget cutbacks. And my perspective is going to be from the perspective of a manager at any level, anywhere from a DG or even a minister down through lower level managers, even first line supervisors. But it's going to be a management perspective from a manager's perspective. And where I want to start is there is probably, in fact, there's certainly no idea about why it is difficult to change organizations in general, but in government in particular, that I'm sure everyone in this room has heard, probably many times, which is this very sort of simple, intuitive idea that change is hard because, quote unquote, people in general resist change. Management consultants say this, scholars say this, the literature says this, everybody says this. So so if change is hard because people resist change, then what leaders or managers need to do is to change the attitudes, to get a change process started, change the attitudes of all these people who are resisting change. And there are sort of two methods, broadly speaking, that are advocated, again, both by consultants, practitioners, and scholars about how to get people to overcome their resistance to change. And one very common view in the literature is, how do you do it? You encourage employees or allow employees to participate in the change process. And this idea goes back in the academic literature a really long time. This paper is literally 60 years old and is still read today. I think it was published originally in 1947 or something. Notice the title, Overcoming Resistance to Change. And it is a study by two social psychologists that was a field experiment in a pajama factory, trying to introduce changes in the production process involving how the employees made pajamas. And so they had like an experiment, a control group, an experimental group. You could sort of look at this. The control group basically was told, there's a lot of competition, we have to change our production processes and see what we can do. And then the experimental group, so they were divided up randomly, was told the same thing, but they were also asked for their ideas about how to participate directly in designing the new job, how it should be designed, and so forth. So they had an experimental group, control group, and basically what they found was that the control group that was just sort of told, here's the change, it's important, did not change their behavior and did not accept the innovation, while the experimental group that participated did change and their productivity went up. And that sort of set in motion a whole strand of argument about how you introduce change. So that's the sort of what's the right word? The nice face, the friendly face, the smiley face of change leadership in organizations. Then there's also the mean face, which in some ways is the theme of this conference, which I'm going to be returning towards the end of the presentation, often called, I wish I had a $1 for every slide deck by a consultant that this phrase appeared in, the so-called burning platform, the famous infamous burning platform. The idea is that, oil workers in the North Sea or whatever in Europe will never change. They're so set in their ways. The only way they will change is if the platform is actually burning. So those are the two. I mean, that's the predominant sort of types of arguments that are out there. And what I want to do is a little bit question the underlying assumptions behind the dominant views about managing and leading change, and sort of ask this sort of fundamental question. And I think it is almost certainly true. This is one of my favorite British 19th century authors, Anthony Trollope. I don't know if we have any Anthony Trollope readers in the audience, but there's a character in this book about whom Trollope says, and you can read this for yourself, I suspect every one of us knows some people like this. Clearly, there are people like this out there, and even maybe there are many people out there like this. But the question I want to sort of start off our conversation with is to ask, or the statement is, if it were hypothetically true that people in government, civil servants in government in general resisted change, if that were true, one thing we'd have to say is that those people would be different from people in general, sort of the way we think about people in general in context outside of government. So, and I'm thinking just in everyday life. So in everyday life, if you take clothing or dress styles, fashion styles, if you think of fashion, clearly there are some people who resist change, who have a so-called conservative or classical style of dressing. I sort of like to think that's my style. My wife says I have no style at all, but whatever. But there are some people like me who have a more classic or conservative style of dressing, but there are also some people like my younger daughter who are what are called in the industry fashion forward. That is to say, they constantly like to change styles. They don't resist change. They seek change. They welcome change. They like change in fashion. Think of technology. There are some people in terms of new technology who resist change. This is not my office, just so you know. Although I am a technological dinosaur, but there's some people who resist change in technology, but some people who welcome change, who like to get the latest new technology. So in politics, you have some people who resist change, but some people in politics who welcome change. So normally in life, in human life in general, so normal aspects of life, we don't say that people in general resist change. We say, yes, some people don't like change. Some people do like change. Some people seek change, positively seek change. That's sort of the insight where I want to start. And the argument I'm going to make, an approach towards change management I'm going to present, actually grows out of, and Gary mentioned, that I went on leave for 4 years to work in the US federal government on Vice President Gore's Reinventing Government program, government reform program in the area of procurement. And so this sort of the empirical and context what I'm going to be talking about is from some of my own experience and some of the research I did after my own experience on trying to reform and improve the procurement system in America. And this is a book that I wrote about this after I came back. Anyway, so again, I said I was going to make discuss both initiating a change, getting a change process started, and then getting it consolidated. And I think the message, again, based on my own experience and research and sort of trying to theorize a little bit out of that, is that many people, many civil servants, yes, do resist change, but not all. And that's an important observation in the context of procurement, because when I was actually hesitant to take the job when it was offered to me. I'd done some academic research on the US procurement system, and I think most outsiders would have said, if you want to look at a prototypical example of a kind of government activity where people really are going to resist change, look at a contracting or a procurement system. Not the least because what we were basically trying to do was to somewhat deregulate and sort of reduce some of the excess rules and sort of free up the system. And most people would have said, most people did say to me, the procurement people, that's their job. Their source of authority, power, or whatever, is that they can tell the program people, you can't do this, you have to do this, you have to listen to my regulation, you have to listen to me. So why would they ever want to change that? So I think people generally would have regarded the procurement system as this is something where everyone's going to resist change. So that just by way of background. However, that is not what I found somewhat to my surprise, when I came on the job. And I want to illustrate that. In the book, I have a lot of data and I have surveys and stuff like that, but I don't want to give an academic presentation. I want to illustrate it. I traveled a fair amount and visited buying offices while I was in the government. And one of the buying offices I went to fairly often was a part of the Defense Department that buys various kinds of commercial items like food, pharmaceuticals, and so forth for the military. And I met during one of the trips a guy who was a career civil servant whose job was to buy uniforms for soldiers. And what I want you to do, so I want to give you a description. I want you to, sort of as I'm giving you a description, imagine your image of what the person I am describing to you would be like, just what kind of human being would be. So 30 years of government experience as a civil servant, had worked his entire career in he'd moved up the chain of command in terms of buying clothing for soldiers until he had now attained the most senior he was the senior uniform buyer for the US military, 30-year civil servant. That was his job. His job was, he was the czar of clothing, of uniform buying. Okay, so just think what you think such a person would be like, and now I'm going to show you the business card he gave me when I came to visit his office. My point is that not everyone is what our stereotype of them is. And what I discovered to my surprise when I came into the government as a senior political appointee in the US system, and sort of, again, I don't want to go into my research, the research part, if you want to read the book, but there's more of this on the book, in the book, but I discovered that there was, even in the procurement system, what I called a change vanguard. And what I mean by a change vanguard, I sometimes call them procurement reformers before procurement reform. What I mean by that is these were people who, civil servants at all levels of the system, from frontline up through middle managers and senior career managers, who, not because of Vice President Gore, because of Kelman, before we ever appeared in Washington, these were people within the system who supported the ideas change ideas that we were going to be trying to introduce. But the key idea I want to get across is not because of us. I take no credit for them. We didn't persuade them. We didn't, whatever. We didn't. They were there before we were, and they had these ideas before we came in. So these are the people who are called the change vanguard. In my research, I estimated it was about 15% of the frontline people in the system and about a third of the first-line managers in the system. So just to give you a feel, it is not a majority. It is far from everybody, but it's not nobody. Okay, and then so why would somebody have been in this change vanguard? Now, some of it is obviously going to be specific to procurement, but I want to try to make it a little bit more general for you in your various jobs. What I found in the research was the most obvious reason somebody was in the change vanguard was for various reasons they didn't like the way their organization was working at the time. And usually because in the procurement context, it was often because it was people who felt, I want to be able to sort of use my head, come up with ideas, think, be active, and I was too passive as a sort of just a receptacle for rules. And that was the most common sort of source of just not liking the way their jobs were working, working then. And then again, not surprisingly also, they were also people who felt that the way the system was working, they believed in the missions of their organization. In this case, the mission of the organization for whom they were buying, whether it be a health organization or a military organization or whatever. They believed in that mission and felt the procurement system was not doing a good enough job helping with the mission. The next thing was sort of interesting. I asked some questions in the survey I did. Actually, I said I like taking risks. Maybe I'd even call it more adventuresome. In the survey I did for the academic research of both frontline and first-line supervising contract procurement professionals, I asked them some questions that had not only nothing to do with contracting, they had nothing to do with government. One of the questions was, I can't understand, agree or disagree, I can't understand people who like to climb mountains. And another question was, when I go into a new city, I like to explore the city on my own without a map. So those were two questions. It turned out, when I did the data analysis, that the single strongest predictor, most associated with whether you were in the change vanguard, was the people who like to walk in a new city without a map or who could understand why somebody would want to climb mountains. That was the best way to predict whether they were in the change vanguard or not. So it was just sort of an individual personality trait of being more adventurous or more, or more venturesome. And then last, the people in the change vanguard, again, maybe won't be surprised, I had a question in my survey. I consider myself an idealist rather than a practical person. The more you agreed with that statement, the more likely you would be in the change vanguard. Again, it's sort of logical. These were not the people running the system. It was on the outs of the existing culture. So to do that, why would you do that? You want to be a little bit more idealistic. So these were the kinds of people who I found were in this change vanguard, the people who were ready to change even before Steve Kelman or Vice President Gore arrived in town. So the point of that, and this is for all of you who are managers, this is the key. If you remember one thing from this discussion, this is what I want you to remember. I think that it is very easy for us to operate under the assumption when we are trying to introduce a change program that we are there on the mountain with the vision and know what we want to do, but that everyone's against us and we don't have any allies. And this is an empirical statement. It's not a theoretical statement. Is it possible in your organization that when you try to introduce a change, nobody will support you? On theoretical grounds, I can't say it's impossible. What I would say is, before you make the assumption that everyone's going to be against me, everyone resists change, therefore I either participate or I have to scare them or do these things, first look around and ask yourself the question, on the front lines and the first line supervisors, do I have allies who, not because of me, again, we shouldn't flatter ourselves. They haven't been persuaded by us. They want these kinds of changes anyway. And I think the first question we as managers need to ask as we begin a change process is, are there people like this? And then my job is, how do I use them to bring about a change process? And so the message I want to leave you with on initiating a process, getting it started, the change vanguard cannot institute change by itself. There are too few of them. Normally there are ideas about deference to senior managers and so forth. So they're generally not going to get started doing this themselves. Okay, I found some evidence, again, in my research, there were some of these managers who actually did try to do things on their own, but most of them sort of were silently hoping for change. But on the other hand, the leaders can't introduce change by themselves. I mean, the people, to use Doug's phrase, on the coalface, they're the ones who do the work. I mean, at the end of the day, they are the only ones who can change. So leaders can't institute change by themselves. Both groups. There's really I guess, again, the key point I'd want to make about initiating a change process is there needs to be a symbiosis. Both the leaders and the change vanguard are both necessary to get this happening. And how does it happen? And again, this key idea, and really also I see it in my data in the book that I did. The way a change process gets started is that the change vanguard, when a change effort is announced by leaders, sees this change program coming from the top as an opportunity to do things they wanted to do anyway, but didn't feel empowered to do or didn't feel able to do. So the leaders sort of announce and saying, we're getting started on this change effort, and then the change vanguard, sort of on its own, gets going trying to to do changes. And so that's the origin of the title of the book. What I want to try to do is as a professor, I believe in the power of words. For good or bad, words have a lot of influence over us. And as long as managers have this idea in our heads, resistance, those words, the resistance words, I don't want to reply. I'm not saying there's no resistance there. What I'm saying is that I want you to open your minds to a different verb, get away from overcoming resistance. These kinds of words we normally use into this other verb, unleash. That your job as a manager or leader is to try to unleash change. And given that, people often ask me when I was in the government, Kelman, what are you going to do about the people who don't agree with the changes you're trying to do? And what I always say to them is, I'm not going to worry about them right now. If I can get the frontline people and the first-line managers in the organization who already agree with what I want to do to translate their verbal agreement into actually doing something different and change their behavior, that will produce a huge change by itself. So I think this is the last lesson in terms of what your priorities as a leader should be. Let me talk a little bit about consolidating a change effort, and I'm going to talk about just a little bit about the context of crisis and pressure and so forth. So consolidating means, how do you get it from it basically not dying in childbirth to a situation where it becomes more part of the way you do business? And obviously, at some point, if it doesn't actually improve productivity or service delivery or something, it's not going to get consolidated, and it shouldn't get consolidated. I mean, there are a lot of change efforts either that seem like a good idea and we should try them, but turns out they don't work, and that's fine. And we, in fact, sometimes should honor people who conscientiously try good change efforts and turn out not, or innovation efforts turn out not to work. Sometimes they were bad ideas in the first place. Both that's around. So this is obviously important, although just very quickly as a sidebar, I should note there's a lot of evidence that the initial productivity impact of a change effort, the initial impact is almost always negative because of learning curve effects. So if you've been doing business this way for a long time, you are the best you can at an inefficient way of doing business. And when you introduce a new way of doing business, even if it's eventually going to be more productive, people have not gone down the learning curve yet. They're learning a new way to do things. And almost always, there's an initial productivity decline from a change, even if it eventually goes up here. So although you can't, if it keeps on going down, then you got to worry. But one thing you almost ought to warn your superiors about in the first place when you're introducing a productivity change improvement effort is that warn them, inoculate them. And just think of the idea of learning curve. That'll make it intuitive to people that when people are starting a new way of doing business, they have not gone down the learning curve yet, and their productivity actually initially is likely to go down. So anyway, so successes are important, but I think it's one interesting thing, I don't know if any of you have read Malcolm Gladwell's stuff, Tipping Point, there's a lot of academic literature on this, is the idea that change can also feed on itself. That is to say, the very process of, or action of initiating an effort and persisting with the effort can set forces in motion that encourage the effort to get consolidated, to keep expanding. And actually in the book, I have I think 14 or 15 different ways this can take place that I tested. And I'm actually not going to, I'm going to just to illustrate, I'm not going to talk about the first one. I'm going to talk about the second as an example of how simply starting something can get it going. This actually involves, do you have this phrase in Australia? This comes from these salesmen who knock on your door to try to sell you an appliance. I don't think we have them anymore in the US. It's all on the internet now. But they would always say, if I can get my foot in the door, I can always make a sale. There was an amazing, one of my favorite social psychology experiments was done a number of years ago by some social psychologists at Stanford. And what they did was they went to a random sample of houses in a neighborhood and showed the people a petition that said, "We support safe driving," and asked people to sign the petition. Not surprisingly, everyone signed. It was incredibly uncontroversial to be opposed to safe driving, so everyone signed the petition. That was stage one. Stage two, a week later, they sent a different group of researchers back to the same neighborhood. Half of them went to the original houses, and half of them went to another sample of houses. This time, they came with them with a large, several meters square sign, yard sign. We haven't, in the U.S., people sometimes put signs or things like for election campaigns or whatever on their yard that said, "Drive safely." And it was very sloppy. The writing was very ugly, and it was very large. And they asked people, "Will you put this sign in front of your house, on your yard?" And what they found was, this is really amazing, of the people who had not been approached a week earlier with this uncontroversial petition, only 20% agreed to put the yard sign in front of their house. Of the people who a week earlier had done this really simple, uncontroversial thing of signing this petition saying drive safely, 62%, 20% versus 62%, agreed to put the yard sign in front of their house. And the idea behind this is that if you can get people to change their behavior in a small way, in a simple way, in a non-controversial way that is related to your change program, but the simplest part of your change program, the most non-controversial part of your change program, it then becomes easier to get them to do larger things later on. And so here I think the message for managers and leaders is really simple to say, but really hard to do, and it is, don't get bored. Again, simple to say, hard to do. I believe that most change efforts that fail because the leaders of the effort fall victim to the really, I have this, everyone, we're all like this, of sort of saying, well, I've been working on this for the last few months, now it's the same old, time for me to go on to something else. And when you as the leader abandon your attention and persistence on the change process too early, you then lose the opportunity to take advantage of all of their, again, I think I identified 14 different ways that simply persisting in this effort or in a change effort would help it get consolidated. You lose that opportunity if you get bored and you fall victim to the normal human tendency. So that's on consolidation. Let me just conclude by talking a little bit about change in the context of austerity and pressure, and back to the burning platform, which I have sort of ignored up to now. Burning platform. I think so there's again in this is an underlying sort of argument and sort of causal reasoning pattern about why this is a good way to bring about change, particularly in government. And it starts with the idea, and I'm putting it in simple language, but I think that's the language that most voters and most citizens sort of have, which is, you guys in government, you have it too easy. You have too easy a life. This is the life of the civil servant. You guys just have it too easy. And why is that? It's that way because government is a monopoly. You don't face competition. You can't fire people. Again, things that are very, very common in the discourse. The famous British economist James Hicks once said the best of monopoly profits is a quiet life. And so the idea is that how do you remedy this and how do you bring about change in government? Either you introduce more competition. Again, the idea is that competition, and there's a lot of evidence that competition spurs better performance. We certainly see that in terms of innovation in the private sector. So one idea is you sort of, by competition, you sort of get people's competitive juices going, or you through job layoffs, budget cuts, you sort of you frighten people. You sort of you scare people. Budget cuts, redundancies. Getting rid of. I guess we said in the U.S. fire people. You would say redundancies, and you sort of that's what you're trying to do. You are scaring people, and you hope that they will become so scared that they will react and change and improve and so forth under this pressure. Now, so is that a plausible, or to what extent or under what circumstances is that a plausible mechanism for producing change, or either of those, competition or redundancies, budget cutbacks, and so forth? So I think the short answer is, Gary, here it is. I don't know if Rahm Emanuel, I don't know if he started this phrase, but I know Gary referred to it before. And that's sort of the basic idea, and Gary referred to it. So what do we know about this? And I think the short answer, or a short answer, is we don't know. We, i.e. the research community, don't know quite enough. In fact, I go even further than that, say we don't know enough at all. And I'm actually hoping over the next few years to either in a field experiment context or actually to do more academic research on the impact of different kinds of pressure, crisis, whatever, on performance. So I don't think we know enough. But let me just sort of summarize at least the literature I know about coming out of psychology. So the first is, and this finding is 100 years old. It's really old. But it's still quoted today. It's still considered valid today by psychologists, which is the idea of a reverse U impact of the impact of stress on performance. By reverse U, what it means is that when stress levels are very low, increasing stress up to a point improves performance. But then after a while, at very high levels of stress, performance starts going down. So it's a reverse U. And of course, it's a little bit hard to know where you are on that reverse U in advance. And also, employees may differ on that. But that's a well-established finding in social psychology. A second problem from in terms of the, or issue, in terms of the analogy of competition in government is that in a private sector context, of course, competition has both upsides and downsides. And you face the opportunity of increased market share, increased profits, increased salary, increased stock price, increase all sorts of things if you do well in the competition. And even in the private sector, the research is that, or there's again a fair amount of research that companies, private sector companies that are doing badly in competition as opposed to those who are holding their own or doing well in competition, they have downsizing, that the bulk of the evidence is that downsizing in the private sector context has a negative impact on productivity and performance of the people who are left. And so there's a problem or an issue in a government context where you sort of say, well, we need to, the government people need to face more competition, that if the only benefit, they're not going to get stock options, they're not going to get whatever, the only benefit is avoiding going worse, avoiding being fired, it's unclear whether that's going to have the same positive effect on performance as competition may have in the in the private sector. This doesn't come from psychology, it's more clinical psychology. There is a lot of research that stress over a long term has really very nasty health impacts, cardiovascular impacts, stroke, heart attack. Even there's some suggestion of, the research isn't as good on there on cancer. And it raises a question about whether you want to use sort of long-term stressing on people as a way to try to improve their performance. And then last is there's a fair, I would say considerable amount of academic evidence that threats may get people to, at least up to a certain point, work harder on doing their existing tasks, but reduce their creativity and innovation. Is what the basic research shows. When you're under a threat situation, you very much concentrate your effort. You lose your peripheral vision. It's like the creature defending themselves against the tiger attacking them in the cave or whatever. They're focused on this very, very narrowly focused. They do a lot on the narrow focus, but they lose their peripheral vision. And there's a pretty large amount of evidence that under threat situations, creativity tends to go down. So I'm going to finish. So I somewhat mistitled this slide. I should say framing a crisis, maybe is what I should say. I think framing, how managers frame a crisis, and I don't have, here I'm more speculating. We have a little bit less evidence, but this one there is evidence on. There's a fairly large amount of evidence from social psych that the performance impact of stress depends on the extent to which the people who are subject to the stress conceive of it or frame it in their own minds as a threat or a challenge. If you frame it as a challenge, that elicits better performance. Again, a thing for managers to think about in an environment of stress, what you do and what the organization does to frame the stress. And in particular, and we're in a very tight budget environment now in the U.S. We have furloughs in the federal government, and we're in a sort of ongoing budget crisis. And what I've been sort of saying in my blog, among other places, but also when I speak to government audiences, is, I mean, this very bad budget environment in the U.S. has very much demoralized a lot of civil servants. And there are these stories out there of people putting out when they're on furlough for a day and they leave on their voicemail something like, "I'm not allowed to work today. I'll get back to you when I have a chance," or something. These sort of certainly not so good from the perspective of the public. But what I've been saying to these employees is, if you so you have this bad budget environment, if you let it sort of get to you and get yourself demoralized, annoyed, bad stuff in your stomach, in some you're really only hurting yourself. I mean, you're not going to make the bad budget environment go away by getting angry or getting a bad feeling in your stomach, getting stressed out, and so forth. I mean, you're just doubling the problem if you let it get to you. So if for no other reason your own psychological health, you want to try to react to this by thinking about how can I as an employee respond to this creatively by trying to fight back and do something actively to try to improve the situation. I do think, I don't have evidence of this from a government context, but I think my guess is that these kinds of crises, austerity and so forth, provide what's often called a window of opportunity, not so much in terms of changing people's attitudes, but in maybe of all the things they could be thinking about, focusing more on the fact that the government has their organization has a tough financial situation, and they may want to focus more on doing something about it. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about, and then I'm done, and we hope we have a little time for questions, is I think an interesting metaphor, an interesting analogy. Those of you who study Japan or know something about Japan may have heard this phrase, gaiatsu, which is a very common phrase in Japanese political and social debates. It literally means either outside, gai is outside or foreign, outside pressure, foreign pressure. And the basic idea, and this happens in Japan all the time, is that they have like a sort of a stalemated political process. And this actually was first talked about a lot in the context of trying to open up Japan to trade and lower their tariffs and stuff like that. And the way change came about was that you had outside pressure, AKA usually the US government, saying, Japan, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. And that was sort of this outside pressure. But the key idea of gaiatsu, of this outside pressure, is that if all that had happened was that the US government was sort of yelling at Japan, saying, you got to change, you got to change, you got to change, that by itself would not have brought about change. What brought about change was that there were people inside the Japanese government already, inside the organization. Usually in the case for these things involving US pressures like the foreign ministry, they wanted to have good relations with the US. They wanted this change for their own reason, that they wanted good diplomatic relations, whatever, and they used the foreign pressure as sort of as an argument inside their internal debates in the organization about why the organization needed to change. So they would say, the foreign ministry would say inside the Japanese government, guys, we're under so much foreign pressure from the US, we have to change. And they were like we have to stick together, we have to show we can do it. So they were, I guess the visual analogy, this is just an article, and this has gotten some attention by academics. But so if you think about the sort of the standard argument, here's the threat, here's the organization, and the sort of the manager or the executive, are you sort of outside sort of saying, reminding me, well, we have this threat, we got to change things, we got to change things. The Gaiatsu idea is that the leader more moves inside the organization and tries to sort of say, here's we have this threat that's them. This is us, this is them, and we're going to show how good we are, and we're going to combat the threat from them by making these changes. So the leader moves inside and sort of makes himself or herself part of the change effort and using the outside pressure and the threat to the organization or the stress as something to encourage the organization to change to meet that threat, rather than saying, gee, I like the threat, I identify with the threat. So I am going to finish there, so I have a little bit of time for questions or comments. And thank you for your time. And I'm not asleep yet.
We purchase 80% of our legal services from private law firms, barristers. And sometimes we need them to change. I don't have a problem making...
Sometimes what kind of change? I apologize.
I need the people who I buy things from to change.
Yes.
Rather than the buyers. The buyers are fine, they're pretty flexible and we work together, but it's the people I buy things from. They often resist change because they see it as a threat to their income and so on. Because you looked at procurement, did you have a look at that side of it?
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, and please correct me if I'm not, you're talking about the law firms, you want to get them to change.
Yes.
I would have assumed that you are in a pretty good bargaining position, especially, if you either specify certain changes they need to make in the contract, and when you're doing the competition, do you have a problem that you don't have enough real contestability for to buy from these firms? That you have to give them all the business, or what? And why can't you choose the ones who are willing to change? Okay, that's it. Okay, no, that's I've heard of that occasionally. You have politics even in Australia? I didn't. I'm shocked. So I obviously don't know enough of the details of your situation, but what I'd be inclined, just based on the little bit you've told me, I would be inclined to try to make as explicit as you can in your, I don't know if you call it RFP or request for proposals, what kinds of changes you are seeking. I guess I would try to, before I came out with the RFP, again, I would try to do it through the contracting process, because I think I would try to brief your political superiors about why the changes are necessary, and sort of say these firms that currently have the business, they can still compete for the business. We are still going to be looking favorably on giving them some business but they have to be able to meet the contract requirements. And here's why the contract requirements are important. And leave it to the political superiors to say either here's why these changes that we're asking for that may improve productivity or improve delivery are not something we should be asking for in the RFP. I'm assuming your procurement system in Australia, I'm hoping it is level enough that there's not, I won't ask you to say yes or no, not direct political interference by the political masters in the contract award. So once you've put the requirements into the RFP, then you choose based on the RFP. But I think what I try to do is brief the political masters about why you're putting those changes into the RFP.
Stephen, wonderfully almost old-fashioned humanist sort of perspective on change. Where do the more conventional sort of tools that Doug might refer to around targets, performance measures, performance management, appraisal, where do they fit into your design?
Very good question. I am a huge supporter of performance targets, certainly at an organizational level. I think at an individual level, it becomes somewhat more complicated, and not to say I'm necessarily against them, but it's more complicated. But I am a huge fan of performance targets, performance measures. I do think that sometimes in government, to me, performance targets properly managed and led by the leaders of the organization very much fit in to the substantive mission of the organization. I mean, if you have health targets, those are related to what hopefully, certainly your best employees really care about, which is delivering health to people. I believe in general, managers in government have done a poor job in tying performance measurement and performance targets to the things that I'm happy to be called a humanist. From a humanist perspective, the employees, and certainly the good employees, will care about delivering better health, reducing crime, improving education. I think in too much of the debate, and I'm very sad about this, there's been this, and particularly actually academics also fall victim to this, of a setting an opposition between their performance targets on the one hand, and then there's public service ethos or public service motivation on the other hand. I believe that properly managed, these things are very, very closely related. So I actually believe that properly managed performance measures and performance targets are one way to energize the change vanguard.